Well, good afternoon. My name is Bill Kelly. I have some affiliation to the Council on East Asian Studies as an emeritus faculty. I have enormous appreciation to the Council for funding our gathering this afternoon and our visitors from overseas, and particularly to the extremely conscientious and competent staff that makes this and all of the events as successful and efficient as they are. We're really deeply grateful to them. And I'm especially happy that we're getting together, especially happy we're getting together on time so that we can move through this schedule of 4 presentations. This is not before I will be the guinea pig.
Try it one more
Okay. I want to take a few minutes at the outset before we begin the formal presentations at 1:30 to talk about what's behind our gathering today. It is the 90th anniversary of the beginning of field work by John and Ella Embry in a village in Japan. One might properly wonder why bother celebrate the anniversary of a dissertation research project 90 years ago. What I want to suggest is there are several reasons for that. Their work and the monograph and subsequent monograph by Ella that came out of that, in fact, are somewhat distinctive. Unique is perhaps an overused word, but it might even be unique among what is, in fact, a very large corpus of ethnography about Japan, largely by foreign anthropologists, but not only by foreign anthropologists, in the 90 years between 1935 and today. Over 450 dissertations, 260 monographs, certainly not all about rural topics, about a great diversity of topics. It is ironic that in one particular way, the monograph that has had the most complicated set of afterlives is in fact the very first monograph, which is that which came out of the joint field work of John and Ella Embry. Here in this one of 2 sort of iconic photographs that are always brought up to show them in the midst of their field work, although that was not the garb that they assumed all the time in the field. The village that they were working in, Sui, is in the southern half of the southernmost main island, Kyushu. It is, and we'll come back to this later, in this red square, a combination of river bottom rice fields, hatake uplands, going up into the mountains, charcoal burning and other charcoal making and other forestry. It's a combination of resource extraction. These are 2 20-somethings who showed up in a settlement in southern Japan in 1935, not entirely ignorant and naive. John was doing his dissertation research out of the University of Chicago, one of the main centers of anthropology at the time. Ella, his wife, was actually a white Russian emigre brought up in Japan. She had sat in on a few lectures at the University of Chicago before they set out. When they arrived in Japan in August, they actually consulted with a number of leading Japanese social scientists, Yanagita Kunio, but even more than folklorists, rural sociologists and the like. They spent 2 months going around to some 24 different villages in order to find an appropriate fieldwork site with the suggestions of these Japanese scholars, and also Radcliffe Brown, his supervisor, who showed up in Japan during this period. They spent a year, fall of 1935 to fall of 1936, living in Sui, keeping separate field journals, and returned to the U.S. at the end John, in the late 1936, early 1937, wrote up his dissertation, which he filed in May, took a June degree. All of us as graduate students should be as expeditious as John was, and immediately, based in Honolulu at the University of Hawaii, undertook a second, quite interesting research project on Japanese immigrant smallholder coffee growers on the Big Island of Kona. While he was doing that, he revised his dissertation into the monograph, Suimura, that was published in 1939, and then published a second research monograph 2 years later about the Kona research. John never returned to Suimura. The war broke out for the U.S. The war had been going on in Japan long before that, broke out. And like many social scientists, he and Ella were drawn into government efforts as researchers, as advisors, as administrators. John was a principal in the Japanese language studies program to train officers for the coming occupation of Japan. Suimura, the monograph, featured in the curriculum, of course, and so sort of a cohort of military occupation people read that and brought it back to Japan. He also found himself involved in the internment camp administration and social science research in Poston. The book on the right is actually by his younger sister, who came down from Toronto to live in Poston with the Japanese Americans and teach in the school within the camp. It's a very poignant account of that. After the war, it was thought that John would return to Japan. He was becoming increasingly skeptical, one might even say cynical, about the American administration of the camps, about the prospects of an occupation for actually creating democratic conditions in Japan, and chose not to go to Japan. At the end of the war, his interests were led to Southeast Asia. He worked as a cultural attaché, but developed a research project in Southeast Asian urbanism rather than the countryside. And for that reason was hired back, I say back because he was actually born in New Haven, raised elsewhere, was hired by Yale for their nascent Southeast Asian Studies program. In the summer of 1950, he became the director of the Southeast Asian Studies program. And then 6 months later, as you see from this New York Times article, very tragically, he and their teenage daughter, Claire, were crossing the street up near Spring Glen on Dixwell Avenue to buy a Christmas tree 3 days before Christmas. Ella was cooking at home waiting for them to come back. They were hit and killed by a drunk driver. In the wake of this tragedy, Ella rather quickly packed up, went to Honolulu, where she had a decades-long career as a professor of Russian literature. John did not return to Japan, but the book did return to Japan, literally. The SCAP officer holding his copy from his occupation school when he visited Suimura. It played a role in the design of the land reform program as one of the villages that was used to model the procedures. The villagers themselves, when they heard of John and Claire's demise, organized a memorial service, invited Ella to come from Honolulu for that. In 1951, there was talk of an Embry Memorial Hall and Embry Society. That death actually provoked a lot of memories about the Embrys and their research, and this monograph. Throughout the 50s, American service people and SCAP officers would show up having read the book and wanting to see the village. At the same time, locally, particularly this folklorist anthropologist, Ushijima, was important. He was a junior high school student in Shitoyoshi when the Embrys were doing their research. He heard a school assembly program that John was giving and was so inspired by listening to this young American in 1936, reading the book after the war. It drove him towards anthropology. He actually was an early Japanese student to the U.S. He came to Atlanta University in 1955 to get his master's, and then went back, taught at a local university, and spent a number of decades with frequent visits to Suimura to try to to keep up on the changes that he saw happening after the Embry's visit, field work, and after the war. He wrote a kind of historical ethnography of Suimura, published in '71, and then sort of the capstone was this volume in 1985 that's a kind of photo ethnography. There's actually a comparative study because the Embrys had themselves created about 1,600 photographs during their year, which remained as a corpus, and he matched that with a comparable set of photographs that he was taking over the post-war decades to produce this volume. In the meantime, what was going on in the 50s and 60s in rural Japan generally, and certainly in Sui, were persistent efforts by the government to create larger administrative units, to combine, to amalgamate the smaller towns and villages into larger, so-called more efficient units. And Sui was bound and determined to resist this. During the so-called Great Showa amalgamation boom in the 1950s, again, the book, the Embry's heritage was brought up as integral to Sui cultural identity and a political voice, and used to successfully resist the efforts of the government. Ella was brought back in 1968 on the 100th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration in order to remind the governor who was present and the other officials that Sui was the smallest remaining Mura unit in Japan after the Meiji Restoration. And again, in 1985, she was brought back at a time of concern about rural revitalization and the use of Suimura, the monograph, as a kind of symbol of Sui identity and integrity. Hosokawa, then the governor, later the prime minister of Japan. But there was something else on Ella's mind when she came back for the third time in 1985, and that was the book in the center that had recently been published about the women of Suimura. Back in the 60s, she contacted Bob Smith, the American anthropologist at Cornell, and said, I left New Haven in haste. And when I did, I took all these boxes of notes and all that we had, and I gave them to my friend up in East Rock and put them in the attic. And would you be interested? And Bob said, well, of course I'd be interested. They spent the next 15 years working together, particularly on the field journal that Ella herself had kept separate from John of some, 1,200, 1,300 pages to create together this extraordinary second monograph about the village from a rather different perspective. And it was coming out precisely at a time in anthropology when feminist ethnography and feminist analysis was finally making significant inroads into our appreciation of ethnography and theory. So it played a major role, far more than John's book itself, in disciplinary conversations and debates. She was quite concerned that its translation would raise controversy within Suimura. Those fears turned out to be misplaced. In fact, it was well received and took its place along with Embry's original monograph to further consolidate Sui's sense of itself. In the 80s and 90s, there were a number of documentaries in Japan and in the US on the occasion of Ella's journal, but also efforts by Sui to present itself, to brand itself as the village of the Embrys. Finally, coming into the 21st century, Sui could no longer resist the pressures of the central government to amalgamate with some of the adjacent towns, 4 of them, in 2003 during the so-called Great Heisei amalgamation drive to form, what was known as Asagiri-cho, which you might think is a bit odd. There are very few towns in Japan that are written in hiragana, but they could not agree upon a place name. And so Asagiri is the morning fog that goes over the valley, and it did create something of a fog around the separate identities of these towns and villages that were forced together. Oops, sorry, Mr. Tanaka. This was the last one coming out of Suimura, although they retained the elementary school, they retained its Sui Chiku. The Hajiai to Yasarairi no Sato at the top is a phrase that will come up in the first presentation by Tanaka-san. Suimura may have disappeared as an administrative unit, but at the same time, several years later, by a very separate route that Tanaka-san will describe, he encountered Suimura, the monograph, Suimura, the village, spent the last 15 years, 3 years of fairly intensive field work. He is as much an anthropologist as any of us in his engagement with Suimura village, wrote 2 books about the Embrees and Suimura, translated John's monograph into Japanese, is working on 2 other volumes at present. It's not only academic, but has been central to Sui's own efforts since amalgamation to create activities and identities that keep alive this sense of the integrity of Sui as a living unit, as a political unit, as a cultural identity. These are 2 of the books. Is even, in a sense, placed Sui in a kind of globalized countryside through the associations that were created through Tanaka-san and others between, you might think quite unlikely, Bhutan and Suimura and other initiatives that brought the 2 together. What's interesting to me as an anthropologist, among the many other lessons that we might draw from Suimura, the research effort, and the monograph, is anthropologists, like other social scientists, are always concerned about the ethical implications of the research that we do. In the case of anthropology, our method is primarily one of long-term or immersive contact in a small part of the world, a settlement, a school, a neighborhood, a jazz club, in which we're trying to work with and live with and understand what people are doing, what they're making of their lives in this area. And then we go away. And we worry that when we go away, we're stealing the knowledge of these people who have so generously shared their lives with us, going back, getting a dissertation, getting a book, getting a tenure, contributing something to anthropology, and leaving nothing behind. Well, Suimura, the book, and the Women of Suimura sort of complicates that angst that we all have. This is a case in which neither of the authors, certainly not the discipline, had any control over the ways in which so many different people and organizations and agencies appropriated that book and used it for cultural and political and economic agendas and instrumentalities. It offers, as I say, a rather nuanced view of the ways in which, through these multiple afterlives, an anthropological study can find life and agency and influence far beyond the narrow bounds of our academic enterprise. And one of the examples of that, one of the lines, one of the afterlives of that, is certainly in the work of Tanaka Kazuhiko, who is giving our first presentation. As a veteran journalist and writer from Kyushu, worked in Kyushu his entire career, coming into contact, as he will describe, with Sui and the work that he's done in Sui, but also with Suimura residents, it certainly is an example of how something can spark lines of development and influence far beyond the narrow disciplinary boundaries. So I'm going to bring up Tanaka-san, his presentation. Mr. Tanaka is speaking in Japanese, but he's prepared an English language PowerPoint presentation. I'm familiar with both, and I can assure you that even without Japanese knowledge, you can certainly follow the argument and the story that he has to tell about his own encounter with Suimura, and particularly with the theme that he shares with the Embries, the central importance of cooperation in shaping the social fabric of Sui back then and today. So, Tanaka-san, どうぞお願いします。
皆さんこんにちは。田中和彦と言います。福岡市から参りました。今日はこのシンポジウムにお招きいただいて、大変光栄に思っています。そしてこのエンブリーとですね、とても縁が深いニューヘイブンに訪問することができたということは僕にとってはとても嬉しいというよりも夢みたいなことでですね、今日はもうケリー先生をはじめソフィアさんもそうですけれどもイェール大学の皆様にね本当にお世話をかけた皆様に厚くお礼申し上げます。本当にありがとうございました。早速本題に入らせていただきますけれども、今日のこのタイトルですけれども、末村の共同と、そして、エンブリー時代から現代へというタイトルなんですけどね、特にエンブリの末村の暮らしを全般的に包括的に書いてるんですけども、今日はとりわけこのコーポレーション共同ということについてお話をしたいと思います。それでこの共同なんですけれども、ここに本当はコーポレーションの後に漢字で書いておけばよかったんですけれどもね、共同というのは漢字で言うとこういう字を書きます。共同ですね。で普通共同と、発音したときに、漢字で思い浮かべるのはこちらの共同なんですね。普通使う共同はですね。でもコーポレーションの場合はこちらの共同を使っています。で違いなんですけれどもね、共同の共コーポレーションは協力とも言いますけれども、力が3つありますね。でこちらの共同との違いは力が3つ合わさって助け合うという意味をこちらの共同は、持っているというこの言葉の違い、そこから共同組合、コーペラティブアソシエーションなんかはこちらの共同を使うということで、今日私共同の話をしますけれども、こちらの共同だと思ってお聞きいただければと思っています。それで早速本題ですけども、今話しているように私は英語が苦手なんでですね、ずっと日本語で話させていただきます。行き過ぎたか。 まず最初に自己紹介を兼ねて、なぜ私が末村の研究というかですね、末村のことを調べ始めたかということをブータンと絡めてお話をしたいと思います。まずですね、このブータンというのが幸せの国と呼ばれていて、そのブータンにですね、2007年、2008年、2011年と、3回、訪問して、幸せとは何かということについていろいろ調べたわけなんですね。その頃にちょうどブータンに行ってる頃に、実はエンブリの末村と末村のエラさんの末村の女たちをちょうど読んで、そしてとりわけ僕が自分で撮った写真とエンブリが撮った1609枚の写真がですね、とてもよく似たものがあるという、これはもう単なるインスピレーションなんですけれどもね、その共通性ということから、ブータンから末村の方へというふうに舵を切っていったということです。で、ここに書いてあるようにですね、私は研究者ではありませんので、これ日本語で言うというかですね、分野って新聞記者を分野と呼ぶんですけどもね、分野の好奇心ということで、もう素人ながら面白いなと思ったのがこのきっかけです。それで共通性をさっき言いましたように、写真について若干お話をしておきますと、まずこの自然の風景というか、がとてもよく似てるというのがあります。里山の風景がですね、両方とも日本もブータンもお米が主食なんですけれどもね、その、里山の風景がとてもよく似てると。そして今のは里山の風景、これ田んぼですね。それで棚田が、ブータンの場合も本当に棚田ばっかりなんですけどもね、棚田の風景がよく似ているということがあります。これは農業ということ自体がですね、文明と自然とが合わさったということで、ちょっと、農業とは何かということにもつながるんですけども、そういう意味深い風景が両方ともとてもよく似てるということ。はい。おかしいですね。その前かな。はい。 いですか。はい。すみません。この写真はですね、ブータンとスエムラの共通点なんですけれども、この左側はですね、交換労働、田植えの交換労働をやってる写真です。で、上はブータンで、カラーが全部ブータンなんですけどね、ブータンではラコというふうにこの交換労働を呼んでやっています。下はカッタリ、エンブリやスエムラでカッタリ、あるいはカチャーというふうに、書いてる。この交換労働が同じように行われている。右側はですね、家を新築している写真ですけれども、これも村の人たちが共同で、行うという、この共同が同じように行われる。で、次がブータンの場合はですね、今もそうなんですけれども、西農から90年前ですから、有機農業が主流ですね。ブータンは今もそうです。左側は、上がですね、これ、堆肥を運んでいるところです。コンポスト。下はそれを畑に、施しているという写真です。そしてこの、左側は、ブータンも、そして、90年前のスエムラにもシャーマンがいたと。スエムラではシャーマンは祈祷師というふうに呼ばれて、村に5人いました。右側はですね、小さな少女が、弟か妹かを、おんぶして、子守をしている写真です。これたまたまそっくりの写真がありましたね。この、ブータンとスエムラの共通点なんですけれども、これを挙げてみますと、一つはローカルな、そしてそれは外から持ち込まれたものではないなんていうかな、こういう共同が根付いていると、地域に根付いているという点が一つ。それからこの両方ともですね、ブータンは1960年に中国から侵略されそうになるということで、近代化を始めます、60年から。で、近代化途中ということ、日本の場合は明治維新からですけれども、そのちょうど途上にあるということが、背景としてよく似ているということ。そして3番目にですね、人々が、エンブリはコンテントとハッピーと両方の言葉をスエムラで使ってますけれども、ブータンの人たちもとても幸せだと主観的に感じているということが、似ている。この3点が私が感じた大きな、共通点です。そういうことでですね、ブータンからスエムラへと、ブータンも遠いしですね、お金もかかるし、近くのスエムラに舵を切って、3年間、2011年から、単身で移住して、お年寄りたちの話をお酒を飲みながら聞いたということです。で、2014年にはコーネル大学を訪問して、エンブリー資料、イェール大学とコーネル大学両方にエンブリー資料はもうほとんどが集めてられるんですけどもね、スエムラ時代の資料はコーネル大学ということで、コーネル大学まで行って、調べてきました。そして先ほどね、ケリー先生の話もありましたので、1位ですけれども、熊本県の南部、ちょうど九州の中央あたりに球磨郡というカウンティがあります。球磨というカウンティが。そしてその球磨郡の昔のスエムラはちょうど中心点なんですけど、今合併して先ほどもありましたように朝霧町の一部になっている。朝霧町の一番北の端にスエムラがあります。で、福岡からだいたい車で2時間半ぐらいで行けます。そして、次にですね、このスエムラの共同の中身ですね、どういうことかということと、それが近代化によって変化する様子をお話しします。まずスエムラの共同の観光ですね、ホームというのが形態ということですけれども、観光と言ってもいいと思うんですけれども、その例を挙げてみますけれども、主な形態はですね、部落ごとに、この組というご近所さんですね、それから主通りという、これはいろんな行事の世話役です。それが部落ごとに、あって、 どういうのですかね、お葬式だとかお祭りなんかの運営を司っているというかね、運営を実際にしている、そういうシステムがあるということ。そして先ほどもお話ししましたように、ブータンとの共通性でもお話ししましたようにね、かったりという交換労働がとても盛んに行われている。これを詳しくエンブリーは末村で書いています。そして、これみんなで行う橋の建設、あるいは道路の整備だとか建設、こういうのもみんな共有で使うものを、共同で、作っているということがあります。これをシビックというふうにエンブリーは表現しています。そしてこうですね、これはコーペラティブクレジットクラブとエンブリーは書いてますけれども、これは全国あちこちにも校というのはあるんですけれども、この校が、とても盛んに行われています。校の種類もいろいろあるんですけれどもね、お金がない人に、貸してあげるというか、そういうシステムもあれば、宗教的な校もある。そういうところでお酒を飲みながらですね、いつも宴会を伴う校がたくさんありました。これは今もあります。そして重要なのがギフトチェンジって書いてある贈与交換ですね。マルセル・モースが書いている贈与交換の形をエンブリもとても詳しく、末村の中で書いてて、これも重要な共同の一つということになっています。はい、そしてこの共同の、重要な特徴なんですけれども、これが3点ありまして、一つはですね、エンブリが繰り返し書いてるんですけれども、ボスがいないというふうにエンブリは書いてるんですね。これはもう何回も末村の中に出てきます。つまりなんか支配者みたいなのがいないんだということで、学校の先生とか村長さんなんかはいるんですけれどもね、それはボスというふうにはおそらくエンブリは捉えてなかったということだと思います。そして共同は、ボランタリー自発的であるというふうに書いている。そしてもう一つはコーポレーションがデモクラティックだと書いている。でこの3点、この3つの言葉っていうのは後々のエンブリーにもとても影響していくというかですね、エンブリーの生き方に関わっていく非常に重要な、3つの点じゃないかというふうに思っています。はい。そしてその、末村の変化の、様態というか、それを写真でまずお見せしますと、まず第一に当時の、末村軍国主義寸前というか日米戦争に入る直前でしたのでね、もう日中戦争が1937年からですから、戦争直前の状況で、これは明治維新以降の近代国家建設ということを背景に侵略戦争を行いつつあったという日本の状況があった。エンブリーは写真をこういう形で兵隊さんだとか出征ですね、戦争に行く兵士たちの写真をたくさん残しています。それとこの左側はですね、これもかったりの写真です。共同労働の写真ですね。それがだんだん、下の写真は雇用労働、お金を使って人を雇って田植えをするという形に変わっていく。これらは要するに、お金の経済というか、そういう形に社会が変わっていくということの証拠というかね、ちょうどその変わり目にあったということ。で、右側はですね、上は下肥といいますね、人糞を使った肥料ですね、を使ってたんですけれども、下の写真は、これは農薬を作ってる写真です。農薬だとか人工肥料がそろそろ末村にも入り始めたと。これは人工肥料の会社はですね、実は皆さんご存知かも、渋沢栄一という日本の資本主義を始めたね、彼らが東京で人工肥料の会社を作ったところから始まっています。そして、これは手作りあるいはホームメイドともありますけれどもね、そういう手作りの社会からだんだん物を買うという、これも貨幣の影響で、そういう消費社会に変わっていく途上だったという写真ですね。エンブリーには商店が何軒かありました。そしてお祭りも変わっていきます。左側の写真はお堂で、自分たちが運営して自分たちのためのお祭りをやってた。 それがですね、この右下の写真は人吉市の青い阿蘇神社という、これ阿蘇系なんですけれども、阿蘇神社に、実は奥んちの日にですね、サーカスが来てた写真なんですね。これ象が写ってるんでね、何かと思ってたらサーカスの象だったんですね。こういう形で自分たちで運営するお祭りから見せ物のお祭り、お金を出して商業的でコマーシャルなお祭りに変わっていくという時代でもありました。そして農機具がここから機械化の話なんですが、左側はですね、千箱木という脱穀のための木製の道具です。それが下はですね、ガソリンエンジンの脱穀機、機械に変わっていくと、だんだん機械化の社会に変わっていっています。そして、輸送手段も機械化していきますね。牛とか馬で物を運んでた、それがトラックとか車になっていく、あるいは歩くのが主体だったんですけれども、これが列車とか、バスに変わっていく。で、面白いのは当時末村にはですね、自転車が170台もあったそうです。自転車がとても活用されてた時代だったんですね。こういうふうに移動手段も変わっていく。そしてメディアも変わっていってますね。左側の上は、お堂で、行商人だとかですね、古事記なんかもそうなんですけれども、物乞いですねが、集まって外の情報を村に持ち込んで、そういう情報交換を口伝えでやっていた。右側はお酒を飲みながら雑談をしながら情報交換するという、それがだんだんこの左下、新聞です。新聞は10件に1件ありました当時。そして右側はですね、これラジオ体操をやってます。ラジオもまだ少ないんですけれども、末村には3台あったということで、これ学校にあったラジオはラジオ体操に使われた。それから電話が初めてですね、この年に役場に設置される。ちょっと写真ありませんけれども、そういう電話も初めて作られるという、設置される、そういう時代でした。そして、エンブリが末村で書いてるのがですね、この末村の変化の状況なんですけれども、末村の中で書いてる文章なんですね。これ機械化と貨幣についてもいろいろ書いてるんですけども、この機械化の部分でだけ読んでみますけれども、ちょっと日本語に訳しますとですね、今の末村に機械時代が来ていることは明白である。30年前まで農業はすべて人の手で行われた。肥料は人の手で集められた。機械は世帯間の共同を必要とする手仕事に変わりつつあり、共同の仕組みを徐々に崩壊させる一因になっている。というふうにエンブリーは書いています。だんだん伝統的な暮らしが便利にはなっていくけれども、やっぱりかなり大きな変化を受けつつあるという状況を書いています。そして末村の近代化の要因として、3点主に挙げています。エンブリーはさっき博士論文のことね、ケリー先生も説明されましたけれども、1点目は、西洋文明の導入が政府の統制の下で進められたということ。これは最初の写真であったように近代国家を建設するという背景ですね。それが一つ。そしてこの政府のあるいは国家の動き以外にですね、今写真でも説明したように、機械化と貨幣の浸透と、この2つをエンブリーは挙げています。だから国家と貨幣と、機械化というこの3つがですね、大きな要素ですね。これ考えてみると、今の時代考えるってね、後でちょっと触れますけどもね、やっぱ当時こういうふうに時代の変化を捉えたっていうのは、なんかすごいことじゃないかなというふうに感じられますね。今の時代、アメリカも日本もそうですけども、見ているとそんな感じがします。ただ一方でですね、エンブリーは政府はその変化を、注意深く制御していたというふうに評価しているという点ですね。これも後でまた少しお話ししますけれども、こうした末村では90年前の変化が、戦中戦後あまり変わらずに、戦争をやってますからね、そんな大きな変化はないんですけれども、 その後、1950年代から70年代にかけて日本は高度経済成長を迎えます。その中で、私の歴史家がどういうふうに捉えるかというのはありますけれどもね、明治維新以降の近代化が、高度経済成長によって一気に、進んで、そして今に至っているという状況じゃないかと思います。はい。このエンブリーのですね、近代化あるいは変化に対する結論なんですけれども、エンブリーはこういうふうに書いてますね。新文明の導入は慎重な政府の統制の下で加速度の原理で日本農村で成功したというふうに言っています。で、要するに日本農村でこの近代化は成功したというのがエンブリーの結論なんですね。そして僕は今の時代から見てですね、どうかなという感じが一つする。成功と言えるかどうかって、エンブリーの当時90年前の近代化の経過を見ると、エンブリーが成功といったのもやむを得ないかなと思うんですけれども、これを今90年後の知恵に助けられて、今見てみると、この90年後の知恵に助けられてっていうのは、実はビアズリーのこの末村の前書きにですね、30年後という形でビアズリーが書いてた言葉なんですよね。30年後の知恵にというふうに助けられてというビアズリーは書いてるんです。僕らは90年後の知恵に助けられて末村を見た場合、成功と言えるんだろうかどうかなという疑問を僕は少し感じているということです。そしてもしそれが政府のこの統制の下で成功したとエンブリーは書いてるんですけど、もし成功した、少しでも成功していると思えば言えるとするならば、それでも僕は政府の統制というよりも村自体が持っている自力ですね、実際の村の力がそうさせたんじゃないかなというふうに、つまり人々、政府ではなくて人々の力なんじゃないかなというふうに評価したいなというふうに思っています。そしてエンブリーはですね、この共同とか部落とか、共同労働なんかもそうなんですけれども、これが間もなく消滅する、もうすぐ全部消えちゃうよと、機械化とか開閉とかそういう変化によってなくなっちゃうよというふうにエンブリーは末村で何度も書いてます。消滅すると。だけどこれは後でお話ししますが、消えていません。今も90年後も存続しているというのが実態です。これは後で紹介します。そしてこれもケリー先生がおっしゃったんで、ね、簡単にお話ししますけれども、戦中戦後のエンブリーの仕事です。それはですね、開戦直後からエンブリーは情報機関に招かれて、政府の仕事を手伝います。でだんだん戦争に入っていくわけですけれども、日中戦争が激しくなっていくわけですけれども、先ほどもありましたように、ケリー先生のお話にもありましたように、日系人の強制収容所の取りまとめをやっていきます。これでものすごい重要な仕事をしてるんですけれども、強制収容所の話というのはですね、日本の文献の中でも収容された人たちの取材、あるいは本はたくさん出てるんですけれども、この収容した側ですね、収容所側というのはいつも悪役ですね。当然のことながら収容したアメリカの後で、戦後謝罪しますけれども、だけどこういうエンブリーの果たした仕事の重要さのが全く研究されてないっていうのはね、とても残念だなと思います。エンブリーはとても重要な仕事をここでやっています。それとかシカゴの、民生訓練学校で、日本を占領するための士官の教育をやったと。で、この時の教育内容が、実はその後ジャパニーズ・ネーションという日本の概略を書いた本に結びついていくわけです。そして先ほどケニー先生が言われたように GHQ の一員になることはなく、日本に戻ることは一度もありませんでした。そして戦後は国務省の高官として、タイとベトナムに行って、その後帰国した後イェール大学で、東南アジア研究所長になるという戦後でした。そしてエンブリーのですね、書いた、戦中戦後の 重要な主張があるんですけども、これもたくさん、論文を書いてましてね、もう本当に、山のように論文書いてます。その中で2つ重要な論点を取り上げると、1つはアメリカ自身、戦争中のアメリカですね、の自国のエスノセントリズムに対する批判です。これは繰り返しエンブリは論文で書いています。それともう1つは日本占領に対する疑念がエンブリにはありました。つまり、その占領ということの評価というのはもういろんな議論があるので、それは日本の民主化がどの程度成功したかという評価に結びつくんですけれども、エンブリは GHQ が占領して上から日本を民主化すると、それで本当に民主主義が根付くんだろうか、それに対してエンブリは若干疑問を持っていました。そしてそれがエンブリはリアルデモクラシー、トゥルーデモクラシーという言葉を、何遍か論文の中で作ってるんです。このトゥルーデモクラシーというのが中身が何であるかということをエンブリはそこまでは分析していません。だけどこの言葉を使っている。で、僕は想像するに、それは末村で共同コーペレーションを中心に、暮らしている末村の在り方とコミュニティの在り方をやっぱり念頭に置いてたんじゃないかなという気がしています。ここはまだ分析もされてないし、エンブリ自身も結論を書いてないので、私の想像です。そして、今の末の、共同の状況です。西地区、朝霧町の西地区になってますけれども、先ほどもちょっと触れたように、部落ですね、ハムレットっていうか、村の中の部落単位の暮らしっていうのが今も続いています。合併して、末村が朝霧町、合併前の末村自体が部落単位の暮らしだったんですけれども、朝霧町の大きくなってもですね、末地区という一部の地区になってもやっぱり部落単位の暮らしになっている。これは3年間住んでもう実感しました、末で。そしてその組ですね、隣組の組、あるいは主通りというエンブリーがもうすぐにも消えちゃうよと、消滅しちゃうよといった、これ90年後も今も残ってます、そのまんま。だんだん人口が減ってるんで、少しずつ形は変わってます。変わってますが、これが続けられています。そして今もですね、50を超すお祭りが、部落ごとに行われている。エンブリーがいる時代はもう50と言わずにおそらくもっとたくさんあったんですけれども、今でもやっぱり50ある。そしてそのお祭りの後は必ずパーティー、宴会ですねが行われているという状況です。これを私は末に行って3年間しっかりお付き合いして焼酎を飲んで暮らしてました。はい、こうしてですね、エンブリーのやっぱり原点がやっぱり恥合いとカチャーという言葉にあるという。でこれまた恥合いとカチャーも写真でお見せしますけれども、恥合いという言葉がですね、実は末にしかない言葉なんですね。これ不思議な言葉で語源はいろいろ説はあるんですけれども、はっきりしないです。で実は熊郡の熊の方言というのは独特の方言があるんですけれども、熊弁に入ってないんですね。というのは末でしか話されてないという不思議な言葉がある。この恥合い、そしてこのカチャーというのはかったりという交換労働のことですね。先ほど説明、恥合いとカチャーという言葉、これ一組になった言葉で今もあちこちで使われているという状況です。これが今も健在だということですね。いう状況になっています。はい、写真で現在の状況を若干説明しますね。この左上は平山部落というところで、ヒノキ島という 行事をやってるので、これエンブリーが末村の中で書いてる行事です。右側は薬師堂のお祭りです。右下は観音堂のお祭りですけれども、エンブリーが末村でも書いてますよね。堂の外で、宴会をやるという、これまさに外でやってるところですね。で、左下は十五夜お月見です。で、これも綱を巻いて、そこに子供、少年が入ってますけどね、これもエンブリが実は末村で書いてます。この通りのやり方。で、やり方も当時のエンブリ時代のを踏まえながらやってるという状況です。そして、恥合いとカチャーですね。これが健在だということですが、実は今日ちょっと着てこようかなと迷ったんですけどね。これ実は末小学校の先生たちがですね作った T シャツです。で、先生たちはこれ着てたんでね、僕が住んでる頃にこれちょうだいってくれたんですけれども、ここでこういう言葉がですね、アジアとカチャーという言葉自体をつないでいこうと。で、下は末小学校、去年150周年だったんです。その時の記念品でうちわを作った時、これも恥合いとかで、左側の写真はですね、棒踊りというもう踊りがですね、今というか 4つ残ってるんですけどね、エンブリ時代はもっとたくさんいろんな踊りがあったんですけれども、2014年にこれは村っていうか市営で、復活した時の写真ですね、上がね。で、なかなか、これもね、踊りを続けていくというのは大変なんで難しいんですけれども、去年これは末小学校で子どもたちがですね、復活させた時、2014年からですから10年ぶりに復活した時の写真です。これ新聞記事になってますけどね、これは子どもたちが復活させたということです。はい。そして一番重要なのがですね、和面の里づくり会という和面の栽培活動をやっています。これが13年目に入っています。そしてこのキャッチフレーズ、合言葉が恥合いとカチャーということで続けている。そして、小学校ではお年寄りが子どもたちにこういう末のことを、語り継いでいこうという末語り部の会というのもできて、これも13年目に入っています。これらは僕が末に住み着いているか移住している時にです、一緒に作った運動です。で、もう一度言います。すみません。右下がですね、エンブリー資料室というのを今、町の教育委員会が充実させようとしています。この椅子はですね、エンブリーが当時使っていた椅子です。これが、村に残していったのが残ってたということですね。はい。そして研究者がもう年に1組か2組、大体いつも来てますね。で、右下は、ケリー先生が来られた時の記事です。はい。そして地元以外にもですね、全国的にオンラインの末村研究会というのができてまして、これオンラインだけじゃなくて、左下はこれ、今年沖縄でやった時の写真ですね。あと右上は8月にですね、福井で 8回目が行われるということで、これを主催しているのは主に、協同組合の関係者です。これも共同ということの重要さということで、末村研究会が続けられています。はい。そして最後ですけれども、これはですね、日本の調査を終えて、1936年12月6日に太平洋航路で横浜港からアメリカに帰る最後のエンブリーのですね、1276ページのフィールドノートの一番最後の言葉です。これをちょっと読んでみますね。末村の暮らしは厳しい。朝は早く、激しい肉体労働が伴う。しかし、焼酎があり、たくさんの焼酎、これは熊焼酎というお酒ですけどね、焼酎を飲める祭りでいっぱいの、陰暦の暦がある。暗い夜があり、魅力的な娘たちがいる。 月光が美しい山々があり、年をとっても語り合える古い友達がいる。私は熊郡の魅力を理想的なものと考えてもいいと思った。という文章で結んでいます。で、実はこれは末村に盛り込まれてません。これは想像ですが、多分このあまりにもロマンチックすぎる印象的なこの言葉はですね、おそらく末村という学術的な書物には合わないとエンブリーは思ったんじゃないかと思いますね。これはエンブリーの主観が入りすぎてるかもしれないロマンチックな文章なんですけども、だけどエンブリーが学術的な文章を書きながらも、やっぱり日本を去る最後の日にこういう感傷的な気持ちを抱いたというのは、エンブリーの本当末村に対する本当の気持ちじゃなかったかなと思って、とてもこれは印象的な文章だなということで、最後に紹介させていただきました。はい、最後はもうまとめですのでね、もうこれは省いて今までお話ししたことをまとめただけですので、もう割愛しましょう。ただエンブリーの末村がですね、今の時代やっぱり戦争がなかなかなくならないし、皆さんの暮らしがなかなか満足した暮らしにならない今のいろんな矛盾を抱えた社会の中で、エンブリーの末村90年前というか88年前になるのかな、本はね、の末村がですね、よく読むといろんなヒントが盛り込まれているということを僕は感じています。はい、ということで私の話は終わります。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
We thought it'd be interesting and important to have a comparative perspective on Suimura and its afterlife. And one that came to mind was the work that's been done by anthropologists associated with the University of Vienna in a place not too far north of Sui. It's a very different long-term engagement, and it's currently directed by Wolfram Munzenreiter, who is a professor of anthropology and Japanese studies, University of Vienna, highly accomplished, one of our most important Japan anthropologists, a longtime friend. And through his own work and through his guidance of students and colleagues over a number of years, he has developed a long-term project that provides an interesting perspective on a very different long-term engagement that Sui represents. So I'll call on Wolfram to be talking about his own research in conjunction with Sui.
Thank you very much, Bill. This is you all know Bill, and you know that he's exaggerating to a degree that it's nearly embarrassing, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for bringing me here. Thank you, Sophia, for arranging everything. Thank you, Kathy, also for doing your share in making all these events happening. When I got the invitation in early, at the end of last year, probably it was already, I thought, well, there still is a lot of time to think about what I can possibly contribute to a symposium that is commemorating, 90 years of a field study that probably has not so much or more than I thought to do with my own work. Yeah. So my study of a long-term engagement with the rural area in Japan, I think, has no direct, immediate connection to the 90-year history of research on Suimura, even though the account I'm giving is also stretching over quite a long period of time. And probably what's also quite striking is the geographical vicinity. I mean, measuring according to Google Maps, that's a mere 70 kilometers or 45 miles distance between the places. But even today, when you think about the numerous mountain ridges, the deep valleys, the thick forests that will pop up inevitably between the areas, it's quite a long way to cross. And there are good reasons to assume that in former times, when individual mobility still was a very different technical issue, that this also means we are talking about worlds apart. But still, let me already point out that this early moment that I absolutely agree with the sense of studying two adjacent settlement with no whatever distance in between for the purpose of getting more out of the comparison of locality. I think locality as a construct is really important for understanding the social dynamics of any place, of any community, wherever. So and this kind of the distant vicinity between Sue and Aso, or the difference in similarity, I think becomes immediately understandable by looking at three characteristics of Aso. First, the name itself. Now, Aso, we heard about Aso with the Aoi Aso Jinja in Sue, which is part of a network of some 100 shrines all over Japan that are related to the Aso shrine. So the name itself of the region refers to a cult devoted to deities about whom the Kojiki and the Nihongi already would know to report. So in terms of history, historical consciousness, that's a distinctive, different chapter from any of the many remote mountain hamlets to be found all over Japan. Then I'm missing the this one here, right? So there's the family in charge of the hereditary office of overseeing the shrine rites. We also at times ruled the shoen, the domains in medieval time, or were in charge in relation to the imperial line. So the Aso family claimed to command over the oldest family line, second only to the imperial family in Japan. They going back, at least since the written records are there, that is the 8th century BC, AC, yeah. So then we had this picture here showing the particular topography of Aso, which is one of the largest calderas in the world. It's unique enough to differ from Sue, with a highly active volcano in the same name, arising from the unusually wide flatlands at the bottom of the imploded basin of a prehistoric supervolcano. So on the one side, the vast plains nowadays may provide opportunity for working larger fields than in average in Japan, even though accounts tell us that until the mid of the 20th century, there were large lakes or remains of lakes and swamp areas that really were a pest for rice irrigation. And on the other hand, due to the volcano, the soil itself is rather poor, and we know from comparison in the mid-20th century of farm labor productivity, soil productivity, that actually Aso has been quite lagging behind due to the low labor productivity. So for the past 10 years, I was joined by faculty in my team, students, for frequent visits of Aso to study the impact of social relatedness and belonging on subjective well-being. This research program was consciously designed to be multidisciplinary, open to all kind of expansion and collaboration for social scientists, for Japan researchers, for rural studies specialists from Austria, Japan, or elsewhere, whoever wanted to join us and contribute. As the team-based effort, we went new directions that included contributions in varying degrees from senior researchers, from next generation scholars, from master candidates, and even undergrad students. As of today, our decade of Aso research yielded 2 doctoral degrees, a number of master theses, hundreds of credit points for successful participation in one or more of the 20-some classes. We offered students to become part of the team, to eventually use our knowledge, our connections for an independent project in the region. In the classes, students were working with the different kind of material we had brought home, including 3 quantitative surveys on rural happiness, rural life satisfaction. We had collected hundreds of hours of interview data, and there are thousands of photos, audio recordings, video footage documenting community life, the natural, the built environment, historical relics, and all kind of locally produced media such as neighborhood bulletins, tourism pamphlet, town news. At one point of time, our student participated at a Summerfield school and were very helpful to gather data for a survey on household structures and subjective well-being. Then a second Summerfield school scheduled for 2020 couldn't take place, even also in 2021 had to be cancelled, and instead I took my class to a field in the Austrian Alps in the mountains to do exactly the same kind of observation and exercise by looking at the relationship of social organization, of social life in a mountain village in Austria and the impact on subjective well-being. Other colleagues ran an experimental online winter field school offering students to participate in some kind of interview or observation techniques by using a colleague who wasn't using his smartphone and camera while moving around the area in the Asso Valley. So the results findings so far have been communicated in 5 edited volumes, 2 monographs, dozens of journal articles and book chapters, not to mention media reports in Japan and Austria, as well as sheer countless number of conference presentations like today. The intensity of field context, I must say, has considerably cooled down since the global pandemic broke out in March 2020. But we are still in touch with the region that became home to 2 of our former members. And at the same time, we continue working together with our students on building up a digital archive with the material for the storage, for the future usability of data, of like images, audio files, video reels, survey data, print media, and other primary data, because we want to deliver on the promise that we made on the outset that this is going to be a 100-year research project. So the long-term engagement goes back to the post-Tokyo Olympic years, and it stretches out into a possible future in which we expect, or we want to offer local residents in the area the opportunity to find out about the way their ancestors had been living, or how life was like when they were, still to be born. And also we want to offer a coming generation of researchers the opportunity to revisit the field and to do some kind of re-study. So this is part of the reason why we went to Asso in the first place. And to be honest, and this is not a secret, even though our interest in happiness has been predating the return to rural studies, we first set out to do some kind of joint team research. Then we decided to do it in Asso, and only later on we made the decision to look for possible connections between social capital, social belonging, social integration, and the satisfaction, the happiness of people. So that means, in marked contrast to other studies such as the Embry, Suimura, in our case, the topos came first, but the topic came second. Could we have done the same study elsewhere as well? As far as for the theoretical argumentation of choosing this place, certainly, yes, we could have done. We didn't go to Asso to study the organization of social life in Japan in general. We didn't go there to find a generalized way of rural living, representative for the southwest of Kyushu, nor did we want to use it to examine a village life, in contemporary times in comparison to some real or imagined past. In our study, rurality is a signifier of peripherality. It means a place in which that is systematically disconnected from power, from wealth, and from richly varied consumer choices, conditions that can be found in virtually any rural community. So the reason why we went to Asso is historical in nature. We went there for very practical reasons. We could not expect to find anywhere else in Japan the same kind of hospitality and fast access to information brokers, to gateway keepers, as in the place where back in the 1960s, only a few years after the Olympics, already a team of Japan researchers from Vienna had conducted the first ever field study conducted in Japan by a team of European scholars. And it turned out more than expected. We really were able to capitalize on the merits of our ancestors' work, on the reputation of their names. So all students in my place, at some point of time of their training, they learn that the repercussions of the so-called Asso project changed the subject of Japanology or Japanese studies in Germany and Austria fundamentally. Even without knowing much about the study that gave course to this change, its objectives or its outcome, students are raised in the belief that Asso is a token for the innovative approach of the Vienna School of Japanese Studies, and that they, as members of the department, belong to the avant-garde of social science research in Japan, at least among universities from the Germany, Switzerland, but maybe probably from all over Europe as well. Well, at the same time, at least for me, I also harbored as a student a feeling of uneasiness about the pride or the appraisal, since the proof to the claim seemed to be missing or very thin at least. Anyone who wanted to know about the Asso project could have gone to the library, taken out 3-volume study reports published in the year 1975, 76, and 82 as part of the departmental monograph series. The first issue, published 7 years after the field visit, contains a project description as an introduction. It features a natural history, political history, and a chapter about recent socio-economic structure in this part of the Kumamoto prefecture. So the appendix in the book also lists an impressive catalog of secondary sources about the region, about the history particularly, that the Viennese researchers were recommended by their Japanese colleagues whom they encountered in between Tokyo and Kumamoto University. There is the very occasional English language title among these, but Emri Suyemura is not in the appendix. The study itself, or the name, is only mentioned once in the introduction, together with other famous locations, Matsunagi, Kusugi, Takashimiya, which are benevolently applauded as very informative to a certain degree, end of quote. But that's it. And you can go into the second volume that features a concise compilation and description of a great variety of agricultural tools which had been collected in Asso and shipped to be stored in Vienna's Ethnological Museum. Or you could go to the last volume that consists of 2 parts, a study by Josef Kreiner on the history and socioeconomic structure of a small hamlet called Oginoxa, with just 30 households living outside the caldera rim, and another study by Martin Kaneko of the Buraku discrimination problem within a specific Dowa hamlet down in the valley. So, but even those studies, no mentioning of any former research done in English or by American anthropologists about similar problems and similar issues in Japan at the same time or at earlier times. So with the exception of the last volume, I would say for me personally, the largely descriptive character of the first two volumes did not generate too much food for thought, was not too enthusiastic, seemed to be overtly technical, occasionally off topic or all over the place, and certainly too far away from grasping everyday life in the region at the peak of post-war industrialization. In contrast, Embry's study, had I only read it carefully enough before coming to ASSO, would have sensitized me for structuring principles of collaboration or cooperative life that guided social life in the hamlets back then, and to a certain degree, as we heard, also today. And this kind of instructive help must have been all the more the case for the first ASSO research team from Vienna, headed by Alexander Slavik, a trained Orientalist, and staffed by his students, Joseph Kreiner, who just had obtained his doctoral degree with the study on religious life on the Amami Oshima Islands, and Erich Power, a student in his third year, a future economic historian. So the book certainly would have provided an excellent vanguard point to compare and interpret the structures of village life Kreiner and colleagues observed in Oginoxa or in Nishiteno, one of the earliest settlements at the foot of the caldera that gained interest for the prehistoric significance. But the household data they gathered painstakingly in a door-to-door survey and completed with the help of the all-knowing heads of the neighborhood associations. They were only analyzed when we got the chance of computing the data some 50 years later into a statistical analysis program. And I could go through some of the results, but I think time is getting short. And I think for me, interesting still is why is there this kind of disconnect between the research that has been taking place by Austrians and in the Anglo-Saxon world. Why was that possible? Why don't we find any reference to Embry's and the other studies in the publications? It's not that there was not that the book was not in the university library. We are actually holding 4 copies at 4 different locations. The oldest one goes back to a donation from the University of Chicago Library from the year 1948. Then the next one is probably coming, has been coming with a larger shipment by the Social Science Research Council, and is nowadays at the Department of Economics and Mathematics in the library. Maybe about the same time, like the late 1940s, when we look at the inventory book that features publications that are all from the same period. So then we have one in the Department of Geography. That's a copy that formerly was used by the United States Information Services. The donor is the America House Wien, a cultural diplomacy institution that were established in Germany and Austria to educate people about American politics and about democracy, democratic values. And that must have come in the late 1950s into the holdings of the Department of Geography. And the youngest one comes from the year 1964. It was bought for the Ostasien, East Asia Library as part of the Department of Ethnology. And that's perhaps the one that has been ordered by Alexander Slavik himself, who was at this time the only ethnologist or the only person working at the ethnology department with material from Japan or about topics related to Japan. And that was a time when the foundation of the Institute of Japanese Studies was incipient. It just happened to be in 1965, and Alexander Slavik was going to be the first director for the next 5 years until he retired at the age of 70 in 1970. So what we did then, rather than just relying on the books, we invited people that were around at the time of the first visits to Asso and to share their memories or their impressions with us about what they had done, what their role was, and how that relates to the kind of the story in the historical account, in the study report. And we found a number of really discerning discrepancies between the official story and the memories that people were willing to share. But at least we found out that there is no way of thinking about a restudy, because the way the study was designed in the 1960s was out of tune with the development in anthropology in the 50 years to follow. Also, for methodological reasons, it was virtually impossible to gain the same kind of statistical information about household possessions, about the private economic structure that back then was easily copied from the Shiakusho, from the municipal archive, from the archives of the municipal administration. So therefore, our decision was to go back. But we also learned that there is a lot of archival material or material that we could use for building up an archive. Thousands of photos from the times, the questionnaires that were filled out but never analyzed, and other copies and newspaper clips and materials that came into our belongings. So that we were using, that we have been also using for different side projects. So we're still thinking about the ways now of making, how to use that in a long way. So I think this is not the end of the story. Even though we have been gone back to the 1960s, we still don't understand why actually the question that our predecessors wanted to answer by going to Asso is we want to study the culture of a region. We want to study the landscape of Asso in central Kyushu concentrically, so starting from the center with its realms around, synchronically across, as well as across time, with a special emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think this somehow explains why it makes sense that you find a study report that includes a natural history of wildlife, plants, and the historical development of the topography, place name, linguistic place name analysis, or the methodological studies of the Shinto pantheon, or of the contemporary household patterns and migration movements that are all thought to be part of the diachronic or synchronic, the concentric, central or peripheral part of understanding a certain region in order to get an understanding of the local culture. So why did people come up with such an idea? And that is then again leading me back to a very much older structure or older part of the picture. That would be the 1920s, 1930s in Vienna, when the Austrian school of cultural diffusionism was raising certain awareness among ethnologists and historians across the world. And one of the persons that came to study the idea of cultural layers, of cultural complexes that came eventually in historical times to build something like a cultural complex was the anthropologist Oka Masao, who did his PhD in Vienna between 1930 and 1933. And Alexander Slavik, whom we have known to be the leader of the Asso project, at this time was his friend, typewriter of writing down the dissertation. And these are some of the representatives of the ethnology department or of this particular school of thought of historical ethnology that had a short peak in the 1920s and 1930s. So the cultural layers in ancient Japan was a 1,600 dissertation thesis that Oka delivered in 1933. Alexander Slavik followed the model with his dissertation on cultural layers in ancient Korea that was handed in a couple of years later. And they were using the same kind of classificatory system developed by the Austrian School of Cultural Diffusionism in order to integrate observations from material culture with ideas about religion and social organization and structure. So this book surfaced in Japan only in post-war years for reasons that you all know. Idea of cultural diffusionism did not go well with the idea of the lineage of the imperial family or the Kokutai ideology of the Tenno state. But still, Oka was able to make a remarkable career, first as the first director of the Japan Institute that was founded with Zaibatsu money, established in Vienna in 1938, only a few days before the German troops, Austria joined the German Reich. Later on, he worked for the Ministry of Education in Japan as a member of the Institute for the Study of Minzaku Kenkyu-jo of tribes and people as part of the Japanese colonial empire. And after the war, he became famous as the founding figure of cultural anthropology in Japan, basically due to the large networks he had established ever since he had been in Atlatus for Yanagita Kunio. He had been around the world in Europe and also active for the International Association of Ethnology and Anthropology that he had. So even though interest in Japan had cooled down in post-war Austria, the personal network or the exchange access Tokyo-Vienna stayed alive for all the years by letters, written correspondence, but also by the sending out of Oka's disciples and students to study in Vienna. So I think when we have this idea of how to write a fundamental history of the ethnogenesis of the Japanese people or the formation process of Japanese culture, if you think that this is possible to fulfill as a doctoral thesis within 3 years, so then we also understand why the next generation then in the 1960s thought it must be possible to write a local history or a local cultural history of one region with a very small number of team members within a limited number of years. It did not happen, did not materialize for a number of reasons that have a lot to do with the way how academic careers make unforeseeable twists and turns with the career decisions and the movements of people. So what I want to show here is that the long-term engagement with the region may eventually produce their own stories, they fold their own dynamics, and sometimes they require you, when you reflect about these twists and turns, to change your own perception and understanding of the history. So there is a lot of things that change and things that don't change and things that look like they haven't changed. For example, the endurance of social institutions, about which Tanaka-san has spoken half an hour ago. There is a lot that we still see as a fundamental part of organizing social life in the hamlet, even though the functional usage of cooperation has completely changed due to the decreasing significance of agriculture as the economic basis of village life in late 20th and the 21st century. And some things, I think, they become clear only when you compare what you see in the field with what has been written in the books, and not necessarily by books that have been written about the same region, but perhaps about the same problem or a familiar phenomenon that has been researched and analyzed in other parts of the world. when we look at the book reviews now of the Suemura from the 1940s, the book reviews, when it's written in the sociology journal, people would complain about, well, he didn't use the kind of the classificatory class system that has been used for American society and proved to be valid and stable. So why is there a different system in usage? Anthropologists would complain that there is a lack of courage to go a step ahead and make comparisons between the observations in Sue and findings from other places that ethnology or anthropology are dealing with them. And I think this kind of courage and this kind of larger perspective between the field and the books is really helpful. So I think I've taken enough of your time, and thank you for your interest.
Another somewhat comparative view, as Donald Wood will describe to us. At that same moment in 1935, there was another ethnographic fieldwork going on the other side of Japan, this time by a Japanese farmer himself. And the circumstances surrounding that and the publications that resulted from that is something that Donald has studied for some time. He is, like me, an American anthropologist of Japan, much experienced in Tohoku. And for the last number of years, he has put an enormous amount of erudition and time and imagination into a translation, an annotation, an introduction to this extraordinary document, which is a fascinating counterpart to the ethnography that John Embry produced in 1935, 37, and 39. So let me bring on Donald to share with us that story.
Okay, thanks. Should I just hit this one to change? Okay. Great. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'd like to thank Bill Kelly and the Council for East Asian Studies for inviting and hosting me, Sophia and everybody. I was planning to begin by saying that I'm a black sheep as a speaker in that I have never been to Sue. But after all, that is not the case. So please imagine that this is a gray sheep among the white sheep over here. But black sheep, gray sheep, whatever, I'm accustomed to being a black sheep because as an American anthropologist in the Medical College of a university in northeastern Japan, I am a black sheep among white coats, so it's okay. So I'm not going to talk about Sue, the place, but rather Suemura, the book, and its author, and how these relate to an Akita farmer named Yoshida Saburo, who, and his 1938 book, published recently in English by the University of Hawaii Press as a Diary of a Farmer at the Foot of Mount Kampu, Living Off the Land in Northern Japan, 1935 to 1936. I'll sometimes refer to these as the Nichiroku. So as the title reveals, unlike Suemura, Yoshida's Nichiroku is a first-person account, a journal that was written during the same time period as John and Ella Embry's stay in Kumamoto. In fact, the final 4 months of Yoshida's year-long project perfectly overlapped. Moreover, according to Tanaka-san's very interesting 2017 book, John and Ella Embry visited Yoshida's patron and savior, Shibusawa Keizo, at his home in Tokyo on September 18th, 1935, for fieldwork location advice. So it's also notable that what Yoshida did from March 13, 1935 to March 12, 1936 was write daily entries and take photographs while laboring dawn to dusk most days to survive. Whereas what the Embrys did from November of 1935 to the end of 36 was conduct daily full-time empirical research while relying on an assistant for John and 2 housemaids with the writing up taking place later back in academia. In other words, this is a juxtaposition of the academic fieldwork of highly educated foreign cosmopolitan elites who could gain an audience with Viscount Shibusawa Keizo, grandson and heir to father of Japanese capitalism, Shibusawa Eiichi, and the autoethnography of a busy Akita farmer with minimal formal education, no property, and very little money. Indeed, Saburo's annual income at the time, about 200 yen, was roughly a quarter of the average figure for farm households. So, but one thing that Yoshida Saburo and John Embry had in common was the support and influence of intellectually powerful backers whose satisfaction was crucial to the execution of the two projects. Just as Embry chose his fieldwork site and conducted the research and wrote a dissertation with a major goal of satisfying his professor, A.R. Radcliffe Brown in Chicago, Yoshida produced his manuscript to please his godlike patron in Tokyo, Shibusawa Keizo. To paraphrase Saburo's son-in-law, who was a Tohoku University physicist, Yoshida wrote the Nichiroku to please Shibusawa just as a graduate student writes a dissertation to please his or her professor. So, and beyond considering differences in Embry's Suemura and Yoshida's Nichiroku relating to the influence of Radcliffe Brown on the former and of Shibusawa on the latter, we can draw some parallels between Yoshida's ethnographic photography and that of native ethnologist assistant of father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, albeit briefly. This is my goal. But first I'll explain who Yoshida Saburo was and how he came to do what he did. Yoshida's community of Wakimoto consists of about half a dozen hamlets spread along the southeastern foothills of Mount Kampu on the Oga Peninsula in Akita Prefecture, pretty far from Sue. Wakimoto Village existed from 1889 to 1954 when it merged with others to create the city of Oga. Yoshida's hamlet Okura had roughly 80 households in the 1930s, divided into about a dozen maki groups, largely corresponding to dozoku in the ethnological literature, basically kin groups. About 80% of Okura's residents shared the Yoshida surname. Rice was and is the area's main crop. So Saburo was born in early February of 1905, 3.5 years before John Embry. He was the third son, but the second-born son had died while Saburo was in utero, making him a prenatal murderer. It was said in his village that if a baby in the womb takes too much of the mother's energy and attention, the youngest might perish of odomimake. Saburo sometimes took blame for this. So around the age of 16, he began working full-time on the family farm, about 1.1 hectares of scattered paddies and a bit of dry field, right at the national average area-wise, but the family owned only about a quarter of the paddy land. But only about 22% of Akita Prefecture farming households owned at least 1 hectare of farmland at the time. So Saburo's natal household was not unusual, poor but not terribly so. He loved it, but soon came to feel that farmers should ground their efforts in knowledge. He enrolled in a local night school and learned about the philosophy of elder farmer Ishikawa Rikinosuke, Akita's most famous agriculturalist. So Saburo bought books and magazines and read them voraciously, living by the proverb, plow when it's sunny, read when it's rainy. So Saburo's big turning point and encounter was this was an encounter with a magazine called Aozora, or Blue Sky, came when he was about 20. With its proletarian leanings and agrarian concerns and educational focus, Aozora was the brainchild of teacher, ecologist, and farmer education advocate Onishi Goichi. The magazine contained an invitation to join Onishi's new association, Aozora. Saburo did this immediately, thus starting a life-changing chain of events. So one day in 1926, rather than ask his father for permission, Saburo snuck out of the house before sunrise and boarded a train to Tokyo to attend a days-long Aozora session, a study session at Onishi's house. The experience had a strong impact on Saburo. Soon after returning, he married a local woman named Yoshida Katsue. Well, despite his marriage and the loss of his father in 1927, Yoshida headed off to Shizuoka at the end of that year to participate in an agricultural training camp. The following year, he met a regional tenant farmer movement leader who taught him about Marxism. Yoshida thus became involved in the local movement, but probably not very deeply. But Yoshida needed to make a living and wanted to be a farmer. His labor was useful to his family because his elder brother had been permanently weakened by an illness. His brother ran a sweets or wagashi shop out of the front of the house facing the road, but employed a live-in farmhand, a wakaze. So Saburo's labor was useful but not crucial to his natal household's survival. And Saburo had another problem. Following the death of their father, his elder brother signed a small fruit orchard over to a relative to cancel a debt. But Saburo had been expecting to inherit the orchard. So he apprenticed himself to an expert vegetable farmer and subsequently took his wife and infant daughter up into the forest in the small mountain in his hamlet, where he had arranged to rent a little over an acre of rough land for 20 yen annually, and where he had a small house built for 30 yen. The house had no bath or electricity. So, an avid diarist and letter writer, Saburo kept in touch with Onishi Goichi. Intrigued by tales of Wakimoto that Onishi heard from Saburo from Yoshida during his 1932 trip to Akita, Onishi encouraged Saburo to write about his home village based on his own knowledge and on that of local elders. Saburo immediately set about this native ethnography project. In April of the following year, Onishi was surprised by the arrival of Yoshida's manuscript, which he shared with ethnology giant Yanagita Kunio, who reacted encouragingly. Next, he presented it to Shibusawa Keizo. So Shibusawa, an elite among elites who would eventually become governor of the Bank of Japan and finance minister, was more passionate about ethnology than he was about business and finance. Furthermore, in contrast to Yanagita, he was more interested in documenting the heterogeneity of Japanese folk culture and exploring the details and histories of local culture and society empirically than in building theories on the nature of Japanese culture or its origins. So in a sense, Shibusawa shared an ideology with the founder of American anthropology, Franz Boas. I'll return to this. So Shibusawa's private ethnological research institution, the Attic Museum, had begun publishing a series of monographs. So Shibusawa highly valued accounts of rural residents who he called the seikatsusha, the people who live in the ethnographic field. Soon Yoshida's manuscript was in the Attic Museum's publication pipeline, and his community was on Shibusawa's travel agenda. As the summer of 1934 waned, an Attic Museum entourage, including Shibusawa, descended on Wakimoto to meet Yoshida and take photos to illustrate his first book, which was published in March of 1935. So a party was held at Shibusawa's house early that month. That day, Shibusawa asked Yoshida to produce a new manuscript, a detailed one-year chronicle. So he also gave him a large format camera that Saburo didn't even know how to use. He was worried. He knew it would be a gargantuan undertaking, dwarfing his first writing project, but he was in no position to refuse. Back at home, Saburo began writing on March 13th. So what did Yoshida write? His original 1938 Nichiroku is roughly 400 pages long and contains 366 daily entries of varying length and detail. There are about 100 photographs and many of Yoshida's original drawings and diagrams, which he drew to illustrate his explanations of farming methods, changes in certain items over time, and how to make things, etc. Now, the original book also contains a diagram of his little house, maps of his farm showing what he grew in different fields over 7 years, and 2 tables showing income and expenditures over the same time period. There are also 2 very long tables, one tabulating his income and expenditures for the 366-day period covered by the diary, and one doing the same for daily meals, and there's also an index. The English version that was recently published contains all of these, minus the daily meal table, but plus a map showing the location of Wakimoto, a name index, and some letters Yoshida received from Shibusawa. It's about 500 pages long and contains about 200 illustrations. All diagrams from the original book and nearly all of the photographs, plus about 30 new photos that I found in Saburo's personal collection. So let's take a look at the first entry. March 13, Wednesday, February 9, according to the old calendar. Partly cloudy, strong west wind, 2 degrees C at 1 p.m. Breakfast, rice miso soup, pickled daikon. Lunch, rice, pickled daikon, salted hata hata, Japanese sandfish. Supper, rice, pickled daikon, miso soup. Rice consumed today, 1 sho, daikon 1/2. Miso soup, 4 go of water and about 50 momme of miso. We put a bit of taro stems in the soup. This was the amount for breakfast. For supper, the amounts of water and miso were equal, but the stock was made from roasted dried anchovies. And then some chopped and dried daikon was added. This was the amount for all 4 of us, me, my wife, and the 2 kids, for each meal. The taro stems were harvested last autumn. We removed the outer skin and dried the stems in the sunshine. They were boiled once and added to the miso soup. I went to my wife's natal household to talk about my recent trip to Tokyo. My crazy neighbor came over to visit. I heard doves calling for the first time this year. My work for today, I transported a bunch of straw I bought this morning. Soon I'll use it in my hot boxes. In the afternoon, I built a new cover for the concrete basin that holds the excrement from the toilet. My wife did laundry, cooked, and went over to her natal home on errands. At the main house, his jikka, his natal household, Kanezo, the wakaze, had already collected firewood when I arrived, 3 bundles in the morning. He took the afternoon off. My brother had gone out and his wife was cooking. My mother has been helping with cooking and such at my younger sister at the house my younger sister married into in a different hamlet because she's pregnant. Since this is the monthly anniversary of my father's passing, the temple priest visited the main house to chant sutras. On February 9th every year, according to the old calendar, everyone takes off from work and eats ogano mochi. So Saburo doesn't always elaborate on food matters so much. He was still trying to establish a writing style at this point. Some entries are shorter than this, but many are much longer. And he had a neighbor on the mountain who had mental issues, actually. Okay, so now I'll aim for my goal. First, it's important to acknowledge the influence of University of Chicago professor Robert Redfield on Embry's approach to anthropology, in particular his focus on the effects of modernization. This comes through in Suemura, but I'm going to concentrate on the influence of A.R. Radcliffe Brown, which was more immediate and powerful. To quote Embry, to Professor A.R. Radcliffe Brown belongs any credit for the good points in the pages that follow, for he gave me most of my formal training in searching out the rules of a society. So Radcliffe Brown remains the eminent anthropologist of the British structural functionalist school of thought, which considered societies to be systems of interrelated components with independent operation and believed that social institutions exist and continue because they maintain the system's stability. But structural functionalism has been criticized for its tendency to view communities as kind of bounded and its relative lack of concern with history, to concentrate on social institutions as static rules and phenomena that have existed since whenever. Although Radcliffe Brown does address change over time in his introduction to Suemura, I have to say that. But anyway, let's consider Suemura and Yoshida's Nichiroku regarding the historical perspective and the maintenance of social stability. So Embry comes across in Suemura as highly focused on pinpointing and analyzing the rules and institutions of the society, and not having very much concern with their histories or with change over time, or with the village's place in the world and era. Declares Sonia Riang of Rice University, Suemura is oblivious to the international political economy of Japan, of which the village was an organic part. It depicts life as largely static, with well-bound socioeconomic classes and a hierarchical order. Well, I think oblivious is going a little too far, but this is true to a degree. But Embry does begin the book with 8 pages of historical background, and he closes it with a section that Riang says is in slight contradiction to Embry's own conclusion, where he indicates the change in the village owing to the new configuration and wealth difference and transformation of the means of production. Well, maybe this final part of the book on the effects of modernization reflects Robert Redfield's influence. There is indeed not a whole lot on change over time in the main part of Suemura, but the book can't be called ahistorical. So, as a first-person journalistic chronicle, Yoshida's Nichiroku neither begins nor ends with a section on change. But even though his primary day-to-day concern while writing it was the avoidance of disaster and minimization of financial loss, he frequently sacrificed precious sleeping time and exposed himself to swarms of bloodthirsty mosquitoes to explain changes in farming methods and tools and in customs over time. These fill the book and are often accompanied by his original illustrations. Let's move on to the maintenance of social cohesion and stability. In Suemura, Embry's concern with this comes through again and again. He focuses on general village unifiers such as the Shinto shrine, Buddhist temples, the village office, and the school. He discusses neighborhood groups, household member relations, cooperation, labor exchange, cooperative credit clubs, and more. His section on the forms of cooperation covers over 30 pages, and he touches on hierarchical relationships in the household and in society, but not with a very critical eye. Sonia Reng calls Embry out on this, stating that Embry does not deal with the relations of power that are expressed through kinship relations, such as not addressing questions of seniority-based hierarchy and gender relations in terms of power and authority in the household organization. Well, this is debatable, but it is a legitimate critique. At any rate, the influence of Radcliffe Brown's academic training and theoretical stance is strong in Embry's analysis. What about Yoshida's Nichiroku? Well, if a reader wants to find evidence of cohesion maintaining social institutions in Yoshida's 1938 book, they can. The hamlets are united under a single municipal administration. There is the shrine, there are the Buddhist temples. Festivals and holidays and labor exchange figure prominently. But from Saburo's perspective, it's more a matter of the majority of the villagers being united in poverty, especially the poorest. 2 or 3 commiserative classes wallowing in the effluent of the local affluent. Quite literally, actually, because Saburo and other poor farmers obtained precious night soil from wherever they could. On page 120 of my copy of Suemura, Embry writes, "There is never any question by lower groups of the superior position of the upper class in the village. But Yoshida's Nichiroku is peppered with such questions and complaints and derisive comments." Saburo mentions extreme poverty in the village during his grandfather's time and even during his own childhood. He complains about the expansion of a money economy seen in pressure to boost crop yields by relying more on chemical fertilizers, which had to be bought with cash, and in a rise in demands of cash payments from tenants by the landlords rather than rice or labor. Another example was losing the opportunity to grow hemp and produce seeds for oil as people began to buy factory-made cotton string for making clothes and kerosene for light and heat instead. In the 1930s, according to Saburo, the difference between the haves and have-nots was growing. Yoshida frequently bemoans the abuse of the weak and poor at the uncaring hands of the rich and powerful, like when a young laborer gets his foot crushed by a large stone or when young women have to go off to Tokyo to work in factories, for example. He also laments neighbors' callousness. If asked by relatives who need more rice seedlings to share some of their extras with them, they instead turn around and sell what they have to others due to the bad economy, he writes. And regarding the establishment of regarding traditional New Year's decorations, he writes, to paraphrase, "Some houses have stopped setting up the traditional arrangements. Many say that even if they follow these time-consuming traditions and customs, nothing really changes anyway. They just remain poor. But it can't be helped. This is just the reality of farming life today." And regarding the establishment of a cooperative village granary, he writes, also to paraphrase, "One share of the granary costs 5 kan of unpolished rice, they say, but I heard that nobody has put any substantial amount of rice in yet. I can believe that. There aren't many farmers with more than enough rice to feed their own family to the end of the year. Once autumn has passed and they've paid the landlords their shares and returned what they borrowed. I don't even have enough rice to eat. How can I put any into the granary?" asked the poor farmers. According to Saburo, only about 10% of the households in his hamlet were living all year on what they could grow in their own rice paddies. This is the general undercurrent of Yoshida's 1938 book, but in some parts he is blunt in his evaluations of members of the landowning class, casting one as a lecherous predator and calling another a materialistic dung heap. So we can clearly see the influence of A.R. Radcliffe Brown in Suemura, and I think this plus Embry's position as an outsider anthropologist striving to achieve objectivity had much to do with his focus on cooperation and community cohesion. After all, Radcliffe Brown was of the British social anthropology school, which espoused a focus on society over culture, and unsurprisingly, we don't see this focus on the glue holding society together or such analysis of mechanisms in Yoshida's Nichiroku. One reason why the two books complement each other so well. Now, I'll return to a point I mentioned earlier. Shibusawa Keizo shared something with Franz Boas, something that was central to Boas' philosophy in the 1880s and 90s when he was working to establish a holistic field of anthropology in North America while battling racism and the dominant paradigm of unilineal evolution. This was a focus on collecting as much information as possible on as many different cultures and to strive to understand each from a variety of perspectives. He trained his students to investigate local histories and to consider each culture's relationship to its geographical setting. Likewise, Shibusawa espoused harmonious development between social science fields and their shared goals, a concentration on local histories, a search for signs of diffusion and independent invention, the collection in sum of vast quantities of ethnological information and material culture, which eventually led to the establishment of the Japanese Society of Cultural Anthropology and the National Museum of Ethnology. Now, Shibusawa didn't teach Yoshida how to do ethnography, but he brought him into his orbit and, in effect, made him a member of his army of ethnographers, a special member, about as pure a native ethnographer as one could be. For most of Shibusawa's disciples, especially Miyamoto Tsuneichi, the most famous one, traveling to a place to conduct an empirical ethnological investigation was the way to achieve objectivity. Starting anew in each place was like a rebirth, a shedding of the skin. But of true native ethnographers like Saburo, Shibusawa wanted their subjective views of their own societies, and this is what he got from Saburo. Yeah, this is similar to what Franz Boas wanted from a man who was probably his most famous native ethnographer assistant, the Kwakiutl ethnologist photographer George Hunt. In a past article, I explored parallels between the photography of Yoshida Saburo and that of George Hunt, and differences between the ethnographic photography of Yoshida and the traveling ethnologists in Shibusawa's orbit. It seems to me that Yoshida's photography from the period is closer to that of Hunt than to the general body of work produced by the Attic Museum ethnologists, but time is short and I'm here today to contrast Embry and Yoshida, so I'll stick with that. Comparing the photos in Suemura with Yoshida's photos of the period, I don't see so many big differences. In fact, especially as a total outsider, Embry did a fantastic job photographically capturing life in the area. But there are some differences, such as Yoshida's close-up focus on farm work. After all, he was trying to use photography to help explain different types of chopping and plowing, and there's also a stronger focus on handmade items. Another example is the number of photos of horses Yoshida took, testimony to their importance in the community in the 1930s. There is also an overall attention to detail in most of Yoshida's photos, which matches his writing in the Nichiroku. After all, there was a major difference between what John Embry and Yoshida Saburo were doing during the period. The former was researching a community he had chosen as representative, at least regarding the basics, of Japan's farming villages, and writing for a global, mainly academic audience. The latter was trying to explain his own life and community where he had skin in the game to the outside world, but not across national borders. So perhaps Yoshida was the ultimate type of seikatsusha, the person living in the ethnographic field, but one who documented it as well. So I've covered Yoshida's background and how he came to be the author of books published by Shibusawa Keizo's Attic Museum, and I've examined the differences and touched on some similarities between Suemura and Yoshida's Nichiroku. I also mentioned parallels between Shibusawa and Franz Boas, two men who were instrumental in establishing ethnology and anthropology as a formal scientific field in Japan and North America, respectively. But there's another curious parallel that Yoshida was connected to, if only loosely. I'll tell a little story while showing a few more photos. When I was a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology at the University of Tokyo, there was a human skeleton hanging on a mobile rack in the corner of the seminar room. One day I asked why it was there, because Japan's universities don't have holistic anthropology programs like their US counterparts. Archaeology, evolutionary anthropology, and other subfields are all separate. So I was told that the skeleton was there, in part, I was told that the skeleton was there because in the past, the university had a holistic USA-style anthropology department, apparently the only case in Japan. And the person who established a holistic anthropology department at the University of Tokyo was a man named Ishida Eiichiro. So Ishida, a former baron, was also associated with Shibusawa, and here he is with Yoshida Saburo. And so I can end with a feeling of having come kind of full circle, with the caveat that there's still a lot of ground to explore here. Finally, somebody might be wondering what became of Yoshida Saburo and why he's in this photo with Ishida Eiichiro. So in April of 1937, Shibusawa invited Yoshida to move his family to Tokyo and take up residence in a new ethnological research facility located in Hoya village, Musashi, now Nishi-Tokyo City, and serve as guardian caretaker with a monthly salary of 25 yen. Of course, Saburo accepted the offer. He and his wife and daughters left Wakimoto on July 7th, the day of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and just days before police descended upon Wakimoto looking for Communist Party members. Saburo was not, but he appears to have been on their list for some reason. So Saburo and his family lived in the Hoya building until just after the end of the war, when they returned to Akita and founded a new farming community just north of Akita City, along with Saburo's brother Shiro, and a number of other enthusiastic pioneers. Saburo spent the rest of his life doing what he knew and loved best, being a farmer. But he authored several more books and many articles and letters published in newspapers. So he was truly a farmer all the way. Saburo succumbed to lung cancer on November 23rd, 1979, but not before preparing his own grave and posing for a photo while meditating on it. So, thanks for your attention.
ごめんなさい. That Tanaka-san was talking about this theme of cooperation that he found, that many people find, that I find to be central to the Embry's understandings of and representations about life in Sui as they experienced them in 1935, 1936. But my view of cooperation, I want to take it in a slightly different direction because my readings of Embry lead me to certain thoughts and ideas about the what of cooperation and the where of cooperation and the why of cooperation that depart somewhat from the conventional views of cooperation that subsequent Japan ethnography of rural countryside have given us. Now, if you travel through the Japanese countryside and you're looking out the window of the train or of the bus, or you're riding a bicycle, or you're looking down from the airplane as you make your way across the archipelago, this is what you see, and it works on your mind and your sensibilities. You're seeing these compact settlements of 15, 20, 25 households, dot, dot, dot through the countryside surrounded by paddy land or hatake. And you can't help but think that what you're looking at are long-standing, compact, solidary settlements, households cheek by jowl in residential intimacy, surviving through the generations through patterns of succession. That these are natural formations, that they have a durability, that they have a persistence and a permanence, and that cooperation among these households and within these settlements is an enduring feature of the rural landscape and the rural social scape. This is not just a matter of metropolitan nostalgic sentimentality about the countryside. It's also the ways in which most ethnographers, foreign and Japanese, come to see the countryside and its social constitution as made up of these elemental units of the settlement, the compact settlement, and its constituent households, the mura, the village. Now you might think, this is Sui Mura, a Japanese village. It's the same thing. For whatever reasons, as serendipitous as planned, the Embrys actually had a rather different scale of observation, and the account that they drew from Sui departed from the directions that post-war anthropology took. Because Sui Mura, the Mura of Sui, the village, is actually what would be called a Meiji administrative village. Now that sounds like a contrivance. Sounds like a bureaucratic sort of contrivance that couldn't possibly be the basis for social identity and allegiance, but that's not the fact. Suimura, the Mura of the Meiji administrative unit, was based on pre-existing conglomerations of these settlements. There are several features then of Suimura that depart from some of our famous subsequent ethnographies that were focused on single settlements. Most famously, I suppose, Village Japan, an important enduring study that focused on one of the settlements in the surrounding Mura. There are 24 households. The focus of this 4-year ethnography. There are actually 28 researchers. There are more researchers than there were households. I have these pictures of researchers bumping into each other in their bicycles over these 4 years. As I say, it's as true of American anthropology as it is of Japanese Nosong Shakayaku. So there are several, seems to be, implications that were imminent in this ethnography, if not fully realized in the analysis that Embry gives us, that a generous reading of this monograph can help us with a different understanding of the construction of the countryside, and particularly this issue of cooperation. One thing that he did, and Ella was following as a partner in this research, was to select 7 of the 17 or 18, the numbers are a little bit fuzzy in the ethnography, for particular attention. They had a sample of 7 settlements among the 17. And as you see, they're ecologically diverse, different resources. And one thing they quickly realized, or one thing that comes out in the account, are the ways in which the residents of these different settlements were in constant movement around the Mura. You know, there was a single elementary school, so all the kids from all the settlements would come to that school. The bonds that they formed of that school in friendship continued through a lifetime. There were commercial exchanges. They were going from the north to the south to get on the bus to go to Hitoyoshi. There was a constant interchange among these different settlements that constituted a larger social world than the single settlement, and the diversity that the single Mura represented among its settlements was vital to the complexity of their daily life and their exchanges. You can see, I mean, in various forms in the book, the ways in which the scale of interaction and association and cooperation, the way that the several different levels that interlock, sometimes at odds with one another, sometimes at tangents to one another, represented a much more complicated social world than one would have drawn from a single settlement like Nikkei. It's a little hard to read. One of the things that Embry did within each of those 7 settlements was to go around and do a census of every single household. And what you find out when you look at the names, the ages, the relationships, where they were born, the present occupation, is how many residents are actually not part of that settlement for their entire, I mean, it's obvious. Think about it. A Japanese household, rural household, the patterns of succession vary across the country, but they tend to be succession to one child, the chonan, the oldest son, often, but not necessarily. But what does that mean? That means that most of the children who are born and raised in a household do not live their adult lives in that settlement. They go somewhere else. They have to go somewhere else. They know they're going somewhere else from the moment that they're born. On the other hand, where does the bride come from? Generally, and this is a sort of a tabular form of what he was collecting in his census of all of these different households, the women, the Yome-san, come from outside the settlement. Sometimes from within the Mura, sometimes from outside of the Mura. Sometimes it's an adopted son. But half of the adult, what that means is half of the adults in a settlement have not been raised in that settlement. there's constant mobility. I mean, these so-called solidary, continuing, enduring settlements are made up of people for at least half their lives were not either born and raised in that settlement or spend their adult years in that settlement. It seems to me it has enormous implications for understanding what cooperation is and where it comes from. This is the table of content. I mean, we'll put this to a side, although actually this is a fascinating chapter. And the number and the different types of religious-related exchanges through the Mura and beyond is further testimony to this fact of the scale of the horizon of life experiences of these residents to be hardly contained by a single settlement, not even contained by a single Mura. But the various forms of cooperation that Tanaka-san was talking about suggest behind it, cooperation sounds like this nice, simple word. In fact, forms of cooperation, the ethos of cooperation, sort of the psychology of cooperation varies immensely. It is voluntary, but it can also be sort of this felt compulsion to show up. It can be an active coercion to show up. Every household has to send somebody to help clean the ditches. So that there's this range of attachment and sentimentality built into these multiple forms of cooperation that are economic, that are religious, that are social, that range from having a good time together, but we have to get together to have a good time because it's that time of year, to we've got to rebuild the bridge, we've got to weed the road to get through. So what cooperation turns out, I say in a careful reading of Suimura, to be this extensive, capacious term for mutual association and and activities together. What it means is also you can look at the landscape. These are enduring units. The villages don't move much, but the people sure do. The people move a lot more than, again, a single village focus and maybe a metropolitan nostalgic sentimentality might suggest we do. Because, as they say, at least half the village does not have an experience of living their lives out within that particular settlement. So that cooperation, it seems to me, the lesson that we can draw, that perhaps we should have drawn earlier from a study like Suimura, is it does not come from facts of permanence and stability. People cooperate not because they've always lived together and had to work together. Cooperation comes from the fact of mobility, the fact that people are constantly moving out, moving in. And you need cooperation as a form of organization, as a form of socialization. All of those yome-san that are actually on the cover photo of the women of Suimura were not born in Suimura. They come in, they don't know the ways of the household, they don't know the ways of the village. You need patterns of structured cooperation in order to ensure that people come to understand and appreciate and participate in their lives together. The kids who are leaving the household, which is, as I say, over 50%, have a commitment to the household as they're growing up that's quite different than the commitment of the chonan. It gives a very different sense of why I am doing this, because I'm leaving at the age of 14 to be a wakaze in the next town over, and then hopefully beyond that. So that, as I say, settlements are one frame of multiple frames of reference and activity and identity and association. And if we had read Suimura with that in mind, perhaps the course of an ethnography of the countryside would have been a bit different in the post-war. Now, reading Suimura with graduate students over the year and discussing with colleagues, they are often well, it's okay, but it's a little bit descriptive of what am I going to get. Maybe the problem with Suimura is not with the authors. The problem is with us readers who should be reading into their somewhat immature, it's a dissertation book. Most dissertation books don't realize the full importance of the analysis that they are giving to their field materials. But it was there. As I say, it was imminent in the text. It was imminent in their descriptions. It was imminent the choices that they were making about their research site and their research methods and their research commitments. So I think there's a lot still to be learned. I mean, Suimura is interesting on the 90th anniversary for, as we were talking about earlier, the multiple ways in which it has been taken by so many different people for their own purposes. But to an anthropologist and to any student of the Japanese countryside or many countrysides like it, it seems to me that there's a lot that we can discover about the nature of the cooperation that is indeed essential to making life in the countryside vital and pleasurable. So thank you very much. We have in the schedule a set of commentaries, but maybe because you've all been so patient and kind to sit here for a couple hours, we should take our break first for 10 minutes or so and come back and then hear some perspectives from Danny Botsman, Shoko Yamada, and then questions and comments and reactions from you all. So thank you very much from all of us for your attention so far, and please come back for a more active engagement in about 10 minutes. Thank you. So if we can come together again, thank you very much for, again, being so obedient and coming in on time. We're very grateful that two of our local colleagues have been listening to these presentations, and we'll begin a larger discussion from you all with commentaries that they have to offer. First, it's going to be Danny Botsman, who is our senior Japan historian, a major force in the renaissance of Japan studies at Yale, and from my own Department of Anthropology, Shoko Yamada, who has just finished her dissertation and taken up a postdoc position at Princeton, and has immediately given that up to come up on the train to spend the day with us here. So Danny's going to speak first for a few minutes, and then Shoko, and then we will come up and listen to whatever you have to offer. We appreciate that. So begin with Danny.
Thank you so much. I really do want to thank Bill for this amazing opportunity and for all the work that he's put into kind of pitching this, and then all of the work that has been done by our wonderful council staff to also bring it to reality. Thank you as always. So I have spoken with Bill over the years about Suimura and the broader archive of ethnography that has been created over the past 90 years in English-speaking scholarship. And so it's really been an incredible pleasure today to be able to revisit some of those thoughts and ideas that we've chatted about. And one of the things that Bill has also emphasized is how this work is ongoing and how it continues to inspire new work. And so in that regard too, it's been fantastic to be here. And particularly I've heard about Tanaka-san's contributions from Bill, and it was just wonderful to be able to hear his presentation today. Dr. Wood mentioned that he was worried about being the black sheep here. I'm a historian, so I really feel like a black sheep. But in the spirit of engaging with challenges, I'm going to jump into some comments. So my first encounter with Suimura actually came in a history graduate seminar at Princeton that was taught by Shel Garin, who was a Yale PhD and had therefore imbibed much wisdom before his departure to, boring old Princeton. Sorry. And he paired Suemura with the women of Suemura, of course, as he was able to do at that point. And my reading of the two together at the time, I remember being one of like, wow, Suemura is incredibly boring, and the women of Suemura is really interesting. And my impression at the time was Suemura was all about institutions and structures, and the women of Suemura was all about the gossip, which may or may not be true, but you got a sense of like who was sleeping with who, and this kind of sense of the place as a really a kind of place that was full of real people. So it was easy to ingest, I think, in that way. What I do remember about Suemura, other than thinking it was a little dry, was that if you were trying to understand the extent to which rural Japan had changed by the 1930s, just before the war began, this was an incredibly valuable source. And I think one of the important messages still for historians is that it's not just Suemura, but starting with Suemura, we have these snapshots of different aspects of life that really now are incredibly valuable for thinking about aspects of change which have not always survived in written documentation. I wanted to say how much I think these ethnographies remain an underutilized resource for historians. But I also wanted to suggest that maybe the cross-disciplinary engagement doesn't need to be and really shouldn't be unidirectional. And of course, this is something that Bill's work has really led the way in the field of Japan studies. But I do think that history really has something to offer in terms of bringing out different dimensions of insight and understanding. And I say that not so much on the basis of my own work, but through relationships that I've formed over the last 30 years or so with historians in Japan who do really close research on specific rural communities over long periods of time. And part of the reason that they're able to do these incredibly intricate studies is that Japan is truly unusual, outside of Western Europe at least, in having a just mind-blowingly detailed heritage of written sources that are still there. Most often kept in someone's house, usually the household of the family that was the headman household during the previous centuries. Although now with depopulation, of course, what's happening is that more and more people are thinking, well, we can't maintain this house, we can't maintain this kura, we don't really want all this stuff that we can't read anyway because it's written in this weird old script, let's just chuck it out. And so there is a major crisis right now in rural Japan with these centuries and centuries of living heritage actually and written sources being thrown out because there's no one left to keep them. And it's an uneven problem in that some prefectures in Japan have the resources to properly preserve things. A lot of prefectures have zero money for this kind of thing. And so even if there are people on the ground who want to do something, it's incredibly difficult for them to do that. And it is a kind of crisis, and I really try and talk about it as much as I can because I think these materials are a kind of world heritage. As Sekai Isan, it works better in Japanese, but they are now really in danger. So why should we care about these documents? Well, as I said, one of the things they do is they allow for these incredibly detailed, careful reconstructions of the historical life of communities. And it's interesting in light of what Bill was saying in his comments that the term that gets used these days most often to describe these studies is Chiki Shakai Shi, Chiki Shakai. So it's not a study of a village, but it's really the study of like an area or a kind of region, except it's much smaller than a region usually. Groups of villages, and how they've interacted over centuries. And the drama that comes out of these documents is often breathtaking. It isn't unlike the women of Suemura. And if you talk to Japanese historians about why this is the case, they'll say, well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's no divide in the Edo period between private and public. So in terms of archives, what you get is the headman family's documents, which often are also the documents of the main landowner in a village, mixed in with all the official stuff, which means that you get effectively something like the combination of Suemura and the women of Suemura in a single archive. And once you get into the Meiji period, of course, that stops, because then you have an official place, a government office, where all of the official documents are kept, and the private documents about families and about land and all that kind of stuff and disputes, they're all in different places. So it actually makes the historian's task much more difficult. Okay, but why, in light of the things we've been talking about today, should we care about history? Well, and I think this also goes back to something that Dr. Wood was saying about sorry, what was I going to say? There's something important that you said that I've just forgotten, but I'm going to come back to it. Sorry, I apologize. So actually the thing that in the first thing that in the presentations today that really sparked this thought was Tanaka-san's discussion of Embry's kind of portrayal of cooperation as something that happens kind of spontaneously, and bosu ga inai, there's no bosses in this village, people just come together. And I thought, I was very into Foucault when I was younger. It's partly a generational problem that I have, but Foucault, one of the things he said was that certain kinds of power operate precisely by being invisible. Disciplinary power is the classic case. It only works if you're not really aware of it. And once you start being able to see it very clearly, then it's not functioning the way it really should. And I thought, that's kind of my read of why you have a bosu ga inai, no boss, cooperative culture. So how do you get that culture? How do you get that kind of thing? Well, I thought in that regard, Bill's comments about, well, you need that precisely because there's so much movement. I thought that's a really intriguing idea. But my initial reaction as a historian was, well, come on, this is a country where for centuries you had collective taxation and collective punishment. The village had to pay taxes as a collective. If they didn't, everybody got punished. And that led to these ferocious techniques of social control. And of course, Embry in Suemura does talk about some of that, as does Ella in Women of Suemura. Now, again, it's easy to say everything is about that, and I don't want to say that. One of the obvious gifts that ethnography gives us is a reminder of the complexities of these things on the ground, when you get things like actual personalities and other things involved. But nevertheless, I think kind of paying attention to some of those, and that the issue of the mura ukese collective taxation is a very simple one. But you can also think about it in terms of, yes, there's movement within households, but is the same household, the same family, still basically in charge of this village after 400 years? That's hardly unheard of in Japanese rural communities. We had the wonderful example from Aso of the priest family who claims they're the second oldest family after the imperial family in terms of this lineage. Now, of course, it's not quite the same as a bloodline. It's much more complicated. There is shifts in and out. But one of the things that families who are in the position of having to maintain these structures, one of the things they make their decision about who they will allow their children to marry is precisely whether they will be ready to take on those responsibilities. So they want somebody from a place that has similar kinds of responsibilities and expectations, so they'll be able to come in, and yes, of course there'll be local things they need to adjust to, but they also need to be able to carry the weight of this ongoing expectation of the family line. So this is where I think, being able to combine some of these longitudinal studies that are made possible by this incredibly rich heritage of written documents with rich ethnographies could be incredibly powerful. And this is what I was trying to remember before, Dr. Wood, I apologize. But you mentioned the fact that Suemura does begin with the historical introduction. But I reread it, and it's a historical introduction about the history of Japan. It's like the Meiji Restoration, like first there was the Tokugawa shogunate, then there was the Meiji Restoration, then there was this. There's nothing about the local history of this place. And it is, I think that's where there is an opportunity for something. And there is already work that kind of points in this direction, like Martin Dusenberry's work on Kaminoseki, which is really a kind of longitudinal study mixed with a kind of ethnography. And it's incredibly powerful for that reason, I think. So in all of those ways, I guess really what I just want to say is that history and anthropology continue to have a lot to learn from each other. We should continue to learn from the example of Bill Kelly and do more of this kind of interdisciplinary work. And on that note, I will hand things over to the wonderful Shoko Yamada.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you for this opportunity to speak here. It's a real honor to be here. It's nice to also get out of Princeton, which is a tiny village, in my opinion. It's really nice to be here and in this in the company of this really wonderful crowd and be part of this really exciting conversation. And as I was thinking about, what I might potentially say today, I had very little information about what might potentially come out in these presentations, and I was really nervous. This is an incredible crowd, so I thought I would prepare a little bit and decided to go back to an article that Ella Embry, who later remarried and became Ella Wiswell, published in 1988 in an anthropology journal, American Ethnologist, which really struck me. And I don't think this fact came up today in the context of this particular conversation, but Ella was fluent in Japanese, whereas John did not speak Japanese, right? And I think that's a really important part of the differences that we see in the kind of work that they produced. But so in the American Ethnologist piece that I was going back to, she is talking about a return visit that she did to Suemura in 1985, which Bill Kelly has mentioned at the beginning. And I read a little paragraph because this really struck me. So she goes back to the village and she's welcomed by all kinds of personnel, including the then governor of Kumamoto, Hosokawa Morihiro, right? So there's a little paragraph here, and I'm just going to read it. She says, "We next proceeded to the official opening of an exhibit of photographs from 1935 to 1936 that I had presented to the community. The mayor and I cut the ribbon to the exhibit where the photographs were hung in very attractive frames. As the villagers inspected them, they pointed out people that they recognized and commented on the old ways of doing things. Of a scene showing groups of women transplanting rice by hand, one young woman exclaimed, 'It looks just like Vietnam.' To me, I was really struck by the journey that Mr. Tanaka was describing today, as to how he became interested in Suemura, right? And part of that journey was, your encounter with Bhutan and the way things are done, and the kind of the similarities that he saw between the description that we read about in the Suemura book and the way things are done, especially kind of both the landscapes in Bhutan and the kind of agricultural practices that we can find there today. And for me, it's really interesting that Mr. Tanaka is a wonderful example, but it's also part of the kinds of many or multiple connections that people seem to have drawn between, the kinds of descriptions of farming practices that we read about in Suemura from 1930s Japan and Southeast Asia more recently, right? And to me, this kind of I guess the interest among the Japanese people who are potentially reading and writing and revisiting the documents from the Embrees in the 80s and 90s and more contemporary times, and the kind of gaze and interest that they have in Southeast Asia has something really interesting to say about the issue that Bill Kelly was raising at the very beginning, which is the issue of the question of anthropological research ethics, right? And this question of are we just going into these local places and extracting knowledge and information, and are we not giving back? To me, that question is a really important one about the relationship between the ethnographer and the communities we work with, which of course is a really important one, but at the same time, it's also really interesting to think about the kind of attention that the communities we work with and the people around them, the attention that they have to the world beyond their relationship to the ethnographer, right? So in this case, we have the in this case the U.S. ethnographers going into Suemura or and doing work with them, but also it's not just the U.S.-Japan relations that those communities are necessarily interested in, right? Like here we also have a whole different world, which in this case is Southeast Asia, whether Bhutan or Vietnam in this particular case. And I have no context as to how this particular woman that Ella is describing here got any kind of reference to how things are being done in Vietnam. But it is interesting. I think part of what's really interesting to think about in thinking about the afterlives and of ethnographic research is to think about not just the relationship between the ethnographer and the community per se, but the kind of broader set of relationships and scales of relationships that these communities might have with other entities, right, beyond the U.S. or beyond the ethnographer. And it's interesting to think about what implications that might have in thinking about questions of research ethics and long-term research engagements, ethnographic research engagements might mean and do. So that's one set of thought I had in revisiting this account, and also Mr. Tanaka's story. The other thing I was really struck by in this conversation is this idea of the dynamism of village life, right, and especially cooperation, right, and contrary to the idea that these are kind of static, unchanging, long-standing thing that just organically happens. There's a kind of dynamism and an element of mobility that actually enables and reproduces some of these practices. And here I was thinking about the very Japanese term kyodo, which is kind of the equivalent to the term cooperation that we are talking about here. And as Mr. Tanaka mentioned, there's kanji or Chinese characters that are associated with them, and the language the characters he was referring to is one version. Do you still have the yeah, the two Kyotos. But then there's I'm actually thinking of a third possibility, which I think is helpful in this context. Anyway, so okay, there's the two possibilities that he mentioned, and the one Mr. Tanaka was talking about consists of two characters. That's the first one is about people coming together and doing something together, and then the second one, the second character basically means something like sameness, sharedness. Whereas that second character could also be replaced with the character that refers to things like labor, right? The character for work. Amazing. Sorry. We don't have the second character, the alternative second character that I'm thinking about, but I'm thinking about the second character. And it is interesting, the very different connotations that we get from the two versions, right? This emphasis on kind of sharedness, which kind of, to me, calls to mind the attention, close attention to things like form and institutions that we might associate with John Embry's work. Whereas if we replace the second character with labor, and of course we should also keep in mind that the kinds of rural agricultural landscape that the village or the set of settlements we are talking about are situated in requires like immense amount of all kinds of human labor in maintaining the very natural, quote unquote, natural landscapes that we're talking about, right? So like rice paddies, even things like woodlands, those don't naturally exist. Those are products of all kinds of human labor that goes into taking care of them, planting, collecting things, cleaning weeds. So it is interesting that the fact that those two alternatives exist and the very different implications that we get from those characters and the way we think about rural settlements, what that might give us was one set of questions I was thinking about. At the same time, I think it's also really interesting that as much as we can think about the dynamism of village life, which is always really interesting and exciting, it is interesting to think about the meaning that the term village or mura has come to take up in Japanese beyond talking about kind of little rural settlements per se, right? So here I'm thinking, for example, about my own ethnographic fieldwork, which is based in Toyama Prefecture, kind of it's an area right outside of the city of Toyama, which is the prefectural capital. So it's a pretty urbanized part of Toyama, which means that there's been quite a bit of urbanization happening. So what used to be agricultural communities are selling off their farmland for real estate development projects, and you have a development of suburbs happening. And so you no longer have the same kind of village settlements that we might think about when we use the language of village, but it has been really interesting for me to track the way that the word mura still comes up in the way that some of the long-term residents of the area who have lived there for generations, even though some of them have left agriculture, they still use that language to describe or distinguish themselves from some of the suburban newcomers who have moved in, right? And the connotation there is also both kind of they talk about it in kind of characterizing both the kind of sense of intimacy that they feel to each other, but also in a kind of self-deprecating way. So like we are the old villagers. We are still maintaining some of the outdated practices and habits that are associated with outdated, quote unquote, traditional ways. So that's one example. And I'm also thinking about other contexts. The language of village or mura comes up in talking about non-rural contexts. Another example I was thinking about is the notion of the nuclear village, for example, right? The Genshiroku Mura, which refers to the network, small network of state, corporate, and local elite actors who have worked together for a really long time, and then of course to build and maintain the whole nuclear energy in this sector in Japan, and that the term is oftentimes used in a kind of a negative connotation, right? The idea is that it's a small group of people who are pursuing their own interests without necessarily thinking about the implications having things like nuclear power plants. So all of this is to say that it is one thing to think about the dynamism of actual village life, but it's also interesting to think about the impact that some forms of village study, that the kinds of ways of thinking about village life that depict villages as kind of a static, relatively self-contained spaces have had in thinking about non-rural forms of life, aspects of life in Japanese society. It seems like that's kind of going a little far away from the Suemura, the village that we've been talking about today per se, but it would be interesting to think about the afterlives of the whole village study enterprise on that front as well. I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to more discussion to come.